Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today's video is going to be from our most recent House Hacker Mafia real estate investor meetup. This is the second and fourth Thursday. Every single month we get new investors coming every single event. So please come out and check it out. This one is going to be about renting versus buying. There's going to be some great knowledge in here that's going to help you make a good decision on whether it is time to rent and buy and the reasons for it. So you're going to want to check it out. Our speaker is Brady Mullen. He is a loan officer here in Colorado. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, to Ryan, to Brady about what you want to do to purchase your next home or your next investment property.
I'm Ryan Thompson. If you don't know me, I'm a real estate agent and an investor and a house hacker. Tanner also co-hosts this with me. He's also a real estate agent and a house hacker. Woo! Yeah. Tonight, we've got Brady Mullen speaking. Brady is awesome. He does a really great job of capturing via spreadsheets and graphics and explaining the benefit of house hacking or owning a home as compared to renting. So he'll go through some really interesting slides. I think is really impactful to understand. If you're renting, I think you'll really enjoy it. If you know somebody who's renting, or you're trying to convince somebody to stop renting, throw their money away, I think this will be something really worth sending to them once Tanner uploads it. So give it up for Brady.
Thanks, Ryan. Can I just get a feel for who's attending? How many here own your house? Okay. How many here are renting? Okay. And now here's a weird question. Has anybody read recently in some sort of publication or heard maybe in a podcast or a YouTube video or something like that, that renting long-term is a savvy financial move? Yeah, I've been seeing that around a lot. So I want to chat about that a little bit because sometimes they make some pretty compelling arguments. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But first of all, my background, I was a financial advisor and an accountant for 19 years. And about 15 or 16 years into that career, I wanted to start adding real estate recommendations to my clients and help them invest in real estate when that was appropriate, help their kids understand when it was right to buy, etc. And without going into the long version of this story, the compliance department in that industry did not want me talking about real estate. And your first reaction, like mine was like, oh, you just don't want me taking assets out of the firm and having my clients put them somewhere else where we're not charging a fee. And there's probably some truth to that, but their explanation was like, that is a legal nightmare for us. Our E&O insurance, which is errors and omissions insurance for professionals, some of you may know what that is, some of you may not, but they said our insurance for errors and omissions doesn't cover that. We can't confirm whether that's suitable for each individual client at this level. You just can't touch that because it puts us at the kind of risk that we don't want to be in. And so that put me in a weird position because here I was telling about 150 clients, families that I helped, that I was their financial advisor, and yet I couldn't talk about their biggest financial decision that most people, that's not true about everybody, but for most people, like it doesn't take a genius to recognize that the real estate choices that you make have a massive financial impact, right? No matter what choice you're making. And sometimes I hear people say, well, I'm just not ready to make that kind of choice. When I'm ready to buy, then I'm making real estate decisions. But that really isn't true either, because is giving a landlord $30,000 a year, is that a financial decision? It is. It's a real estate decision. Once you move out of mom and dad's house, you're making real estate choices because we're talking about shelter. What happens if you don't have shelter? Like, we're humans, we literally die. I'm not trying to be like weird about that, but it's a choice you cannot not make. Everybody, once you're out of mom and dad's house, you're in the game and you're making real estate choices, and they have massive financial impact. And yet, in the financial planning space, they don't let financial advisors talk about it, which is it is really upsetting to me, and it was very upsetting to me. And I worked with the compliance department for a long time to try to figure out, don't tell me that I can't, tell me how I can, so that it's compliant. And after 2 years of going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, I finally just said, okay, I think I need to go. I sold my practice to some friends of mine that I know and that I trust in the business. They're now working with my clients, many of whom are family members and close friends. But I had to get out of the industry because I was investing in real estate. My passion was in real estate. And this coincidentally happened at the same time that my children were becoming adults and making their own real estate choices. I have some younger ones that are still in high school. I just came from my daughter's very first freshman volleyball game. So cute. But some of them are out of the house and they're making real estate choices. So I got really passionate about this because I thought, you know, as a financial advisor, the only people I ever helped in that capacity were people that already had money, probably people who needed help the least. Now, there's nothing wrong with helping them. There's nothing unethical. I was really proud of what we did for our clients for a very long time. But I thought, you know, what financial companies are paying attention to my 22-year-old daughter and my 20-year-old son? Now, your first instinct might be, well, no financial institutions are paying attention to them because they don't have any money. But there are some financial institutions, some big ones, paying a lot of attention to people that age. Who are they? Yep, Visa and MasterCard, Discover. They spend a lot of time marketing to that age group before they figure out how money works so they can trap them. Like, it's terrible. Like, we live in a great place. I'm super patriotic. I love this country, but that doesn't mean that we don't have room to improve. And that's one of the areas, like, kids don't learn this stuff in school. We learn this stuff by watching YouTube. And how does something get popular on YouTube? Is it because it's interesting or because it's accurate? Obviously, it's because it's interesting. If it drives viewers, it gets promoted more and more and more. It's got this positive feedback loop, right? And if it's accurate and boring, nobody sees it because the algorithm doesn't push it. And so if you wanted to search something on YouTube about how something works, you know, like a CHAFA state, what is that? They call that a down payment assistance program. So there are grants by the state of Colorado that help people buy their first home. In fact, we're helping somebody close in a couple of weeks on a property, and they're out of pocket $1,500 to buy their first house. It's like $380,000. $1,500. You can't even get into a rental for $1,500 between your first month's rent and a deposit or whatever. So, like, there are resources, but if you Google that and you hear people talking about, you know, you don't want to get into a home until this, or you don't want to do this because you might be paying mortgage insurance, or you do want to do this. If the problem with something like YouTube is there's nobody curating YouTube to determine what's accurate and what isn't, and just what's interesting gets promoted, and the problem with that is it's still up to you to decide what's accurate and what isn't, which you wouldn't need to search YouTube if you already knew that, right? So that all became a big passion for me, to help people integrate their biggest financial choices with their personal finances, because I wasn't doing that, and yet I was a financial advisor. That drove me kind of crazy. So that's what brought me into the industry. That's what I do. I try to bring the financial tools that I became very good with. I mean, I spent a lot of time working on those, building some of my own and integrating that into what I was doing, but then integrating it into helping people make smart real estate choices, whether that's buying your first home, upsizing, vacation homes, real estate investing, how to build a portfolio and integrate that with your other stuff, how to do that in a tax efficient way. There's lots of cool tools that the financial community has, but it just doesn't get overlaid on top of real estate because they can't touch it. It's pretty depressing, really. Anyway, so on that note, that was fun. Sorry. So back to this idea that renting long-term is a financially viable option. Now, I'm not going to speak to every market in the country, because maybe if you're in Manhattan, maybe that's true, where they have rent controls and cap rates are really low. And if you're investing in real estate, you probably know what that means. You don't need to know that to move on with this conversation. But in most places in the country, renting is a terrible long-term strategy. It makes sense. So it's better than sleeping on the street. And if you need a place to be dry and warm at night, then rent a place, for God's sake, right? Of course. But long-term, it doesn't make sense. And we're going to talk about some of the math about that and why there's some confusion about that. But the two things that I'll mention, the first one's pretty obvious, and I think of it like this. If you're curious about who's right when they're talking about renting makes sense long-term or it doesn't, if you're curious about who's right, here's some advice for you. Like, look up. See where the money is. So as a financial advisor, guess how many clients I had that were prepared for retirement and they were still renting. You can count it on one hand, even if that hand has 0 fingers. Like, none, 0.
That's a joke, right?
Sorry?
That's a joke, right?
Yeah, so I'm in finance. I have 5 kids. I live in suburbia. The jokes are terrible.
That's a dad joke.
Yeah, thank you.
You're doing fine. Keep going.
Thank you. Another dad here. Thank you. Dad group. Like, it just doesn't happen. So that's one thing. Do you ever see anybody collecting money for the poor homeowners in America? Like, they're broke. Come on, we need to help them. It doesn't happen. They're the ones that have the money. So Forbes did a study The National Association of Realtors likes to cite this study. A lot of people think that it came from the Association of Realtors, and they want to say like, oh, that study is jaded because it's the realtors doing that study. They're citing a Forbes study, which ran numbers and said that homeowners have 40 times the wealth of renters. Now, some of that's got to be demographics, because people don't, if you're 20, you're probably not buying a house yet, maybe, but you certainly can. But you're much more likely to be a homeowner if you're 40 or 50, and also likely to have assets and things like that. But it's not a secret that people that own their homes have a lot more wealth, and a lot of it is just sitting there in their home, because equity just happens when you live in a home, when you own it, rather. And then the other thing that I'll mention about home ownership is a lot of times these people on YouTube that get these followings. I watch a lot of financial stuff on YouTube because I like to see who to follow, and some of them have really great ideas and really good ways of expressing things. But when I see things where they're talking about, well, buying a home doesn't make sense because you could put that money in the market and make more money, because the real estate only appreciates at 3 to 5% nationally, where the stock market could do 10% or 11% if you leave it in, blah, 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 and they'll tell their story. And it's like, hold on a second, where are you sleeping? You can't put the money that you were going to spend on shelter in the stock market. That doesn't make any sense, because you're sleeping outside if you do that, right? So it's not a matter of what appreciates the most. It's a matter of you're going to spend one of the biggest expenses that you have throughout your life is going to be on shelter, and there's two ways to do it. And you're going to be buying real estate with those dollars either way. The question is, who owns it after you pay those bills, right? It's going to be you or the landlord, but it's going to cost the money. And in that, when I was talking about just looking up and seeing where the money is, look at it from the landlord's perspective. Landlords, owning a rental property is a business, right? You're providing a good and or a service, depending on what you want to call shelter, to a customer. Now, do businesses thrive by charging less for what they're providing than it costs them to provide it? No. Like, if I could buy a Snickers bar at King Soopers for less than it costs King Soopers to put that Snickers bar on the shelf, they'd go out of business. I mean, not for one Snickers bar, but if that was their model, was to sell things for less money than it cost them to put them there, they'd go out of business. And last I checked, they're doing okay. And the same is true with real estate investors. If renting really was cheaper in the long run than owning your home, landlords would be broke, because that means that they'd be selling their goods and services for less than it cost them to provide it. And the problem with that whole message, well, one of them, we've already stated a few, is that it's a pretty seductive message, right? If I'm a 21-year-old kid, I mean, we're talking about the generation that invented the word adulting. I love my kids, but like, that's an apt word. Everybody knows what that means. But if I hear, do you not know what that means?
I'm an adult.
Well, I'm not looking down my nose at it. Yeah, so I'm not looking down my nose at it. I love my kids. I want them to be successful. I have 2 adult children that are out of the house. One owns a property and is house hacking. The other one I keep telling, hey, when's that going to happen? We need to start working toward that, and he's working toward it. He's great. Everything's, you know, I have high hopes for them, and I love them, and they're hardworking, and I think that's sometimes a misnomer that they don't work hard. I mean, there's lazy people in every generation, but anyway, the problem with that message is that it's very seductive, right? If I'm renting and I see something on YouTube that says it's cheaper to rent for the rest of your life than to own your property, boy, that feels good. That means if the water heater breaks, I have to call one person. Well, guess how many people the landlord has to call? Also one person. Replacing a water heater is not a big deal. You can pick up a phone whether you're calling the landlord or the plumber. But anyway, it's just an easy idea. If I can think, if I'm convinced, it's easy to be convinced, maybe is the best way to say that renting is cheaper, because I want to hear that anyway. So that narrative is starting to get traction, and it's wrong, frankly. So, I already talked about my background. I won't go into that. So let's talk about this. This is just about the value of home ownership. I'm going to spend a couple minutes on it, and then I'm going to go into house hacking a little bit. But this is a graph of how much it costs to rent a property. So this is about $3,000 a month, and it goes up over time. Oh, excuse me. I meant to have some labels on here, but I don't know if everybody can see this, but this is about $3,000 a month. 35 years from now, it's going to cost about $10,000 a month to rent something that costs about $3,000 a month now. Now, I don't know where everybody's renting. Obviously, $3,000 a month would be a lot if it was a studio. But for a house, houses rent for $3,000 on the Front Range all the time. And in fact, many rent for much more than that. But something that costs $3,000 a month to rent is going to cost $10,000 a month to rent someday. I'm only tracking this at 3.5%. Rent typically in suburban areas or in metropolitan areas goes up faster than 3.5%. That's the national average. But the national average is taking places like Denver and also averaging them with places like Albuquerque, which is kind of this flat market. Flatter. I mean, it's, anyway, another story. But rent is going to be expensive someday. It's expensive now. Like if you talk to somebody 35 years ago who was paying $800 or $900 a month to rent a house, and you said, hey, you should buy because in 2024 it's going to cost $3,000 a month to rent, that would have seemed as outrageous to them as $10,000 seems to us now, but it's going to happen. Now, I don't know if it'll take 35 years or 30 or 40 or something in between. That's just tracking 3.5%. Now, this is the cost of home ownership, or the outlay. This is the blue. I'm assuming a 5% down payment. There's lots of options where you could do less than that, but I'm just using this as an example. Obviously, well, when you look at this graph, it's obvious, but most people know that to get into a house that I own is going to cost me more on a monthly basis for a short time to live there, but it's a much flatter line, right? Now, it's not completely flat. You see some curvature if you look at it closely because some things do go up in price. The cost of maintenance, the cost of taxes, insurance, those things creep up. But the bulk of the cost of living in the home is paying for it, and that's a flat expense for 30 years. So this is the delay, and this is the gratification, and this is just the cash flow. There's also something else very important and economical that's going on in the background, which is, yeah, the equity. I heard equity and appreciation, but yeah, the same idea. I'm also buying something with this money where I'm buying something for someone else with that red line, right? So at first it might cost, in this case, again, this is just an example, but this is $900, $870 a month more. But pretty soon I start to save money by home ownership, and that's while I still have a mortgage. And eventually, now we're talking, $6,000, $7,000 a month. Now, $8,000 a month, the difference, does anybody here into finance? Anybody heard the 4% rule? Does anybody know what that means? What does that mean? Do you want to summarize? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, it just means that in retirement, if you pull 4% of your portfolio per year to live, then probably have a sufficient portfolio to retire on.
Yeah, so that's just quick napkin math to estimate how much you're going to need for retirement or how much you can spend of your nest egg, depending on how you want to back into that number. But it's basically saying, I need to build a nest egg so that by drawing 4% of it, I'll be safe for the rest of my life. Now that includes increases for cost of living and stuff like that. And it's napkin math. It's very rough because it also depends on when you retire and some other things. But it's a rough estimate of how much you'll need. Now think that through. So if I can spend 4% of my nest egg and retire safely, that means for every $1,000, so income in retirement is expensive. $1,000 a month in retirement cash flow is 4% of $300,000. So because it's $12,000 a year, which is 4% of $300,000. So that means for every $1,000 a month, I need $300,000 nest egg for every $1,000 that I want. Now you can subtract, like if you're, I mean, this isn't a retirement planning seminar, but if I'm getting Social Security, I might want an extra $2,000 a month on top of Social Security if it's there. I don't mean to throw that out in the universe, but then if I want $2,000 extra dollars, I'm going to need $600,000 of savings or of investments to pull that off. And that means I'm only living on Social Security and $2,000 a month. So here's where I'm going with this. If I need an extra $8,000 a month in retirement to give to a landlord because I'm renting the rest of my life, that's $2.4 million extra retirement savings that I need just to give it away. And as a younger, dumber person, I don't know why boys I think are more susceptible to this than girls, but I thought, well, I might have thought, well, I'll just make more money. I'll just have the extra 2.4. That's fine too. It's like, okay, do that then, but you're still giving it away. Have the 2.4 and keep it, and then you got an extra $8,000 a month to spend in retirement if that's your goal, right? So the idea that home ownership is more expensive. And I'm including all the cost of repairs, tax, insurance, inflation, all that stuff. It can't possibly be more expensive than renting. Otherwise, landlords would be going broke because they would be giving it away for less than it costs. Anybody ever heard? So I know Dave Ramsey talks about this sort of thing quite a bit. I have a love-hate relationship with him. I think that on the whole, he's great. I think there's some things that he says when you get into some of the more sophisticated financial stuff he's off about. But for the most part, when he says, don't buy a Tesla if you don't have health insurance, I'm like, preach, Dave, that's good advice. But there are some times where I think it's overly simplistic and overly generalized. But one of the things that I hear said, and I hear him say it quite a bit too, and I'm not knocking him for it. It sounds like I am, but it's just coming out wrong. But they'll say, hey, if you buy a house, now I'm using a $500,000 home in this example. If you buy a $500,000 house and you put, say, 5% down, over the next 35 years, you're going to spend $1.6 million to own that home. First of all, that is true. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't use loans. It doesn't mean anything. It just means when I see that, what I see is shelter's expensive. So the point isn't, hey, you could put that $1.6 million somewhere else and maybe do better with it. That's where I go back to that other idea, which is like, no, you can't, not unless you're going to live in a tent or stay at mom and dad's. That's an option too. So it's not that this is too expensive. It's a lot of money, but there's no getting around that because shelter is expensive. So what I wanted to do is compare that to all the money that I would spend in rent over that same amount of time. And when you do that, it's pretty shocking because to rent something similar, I would have spent almost $2.4 million putting a roof over my head, giving it to the landlord. And this doesn't include any equity. This is just the outlay. At the same time, if I buy a $500,000 house, let me show you how this graph works. The dark here, the dark blue is your equity. The empty space is how much is owed left on the property, so it's the debt. So the combination of the two is the value of the home. And as the debt shrinks and the equity grows, you see that's when the loan gets paid off because there's no more loan. This bottom piece is your equity. So you get equity when you own a home. You get it in two different ways because every check you pay on the mortgage, it pays the principal down a little bit or a lot, depending on the phase of the mortgage that you're in. But also, as the property appreciates, you gain equity. So this is showing that by the time the house is paid off, you have $2.1 million of equity. I know that's hard to believe, but is a $500,000 house, I'm using 4.5% appreciation, which is pretty conservative. But that's just saying that a $500,000 house today is going to be worth $2.1 million 30 years from now if it appreciates at 4.5%. It could do more, it could do less. It will probably do more if historical averages are anything to go by. But I know that's hard to believe, especially for, when I was younger. I remember, I understand the math, I see the inflation, but it's hard to internalize that because it's sort of counterintuitive. But remember, houses in this area used to be $80,000. Something that costs $500,000 today, you could buy that in the 80s for $80,000 or $90,000. And if you told them it was going to be $500,000, that seemed unreasonable. But here we are, and it's just going to keep happening. So this is what you get for having paid this amount. And what do you get for paying that? Of course, nothing, right? So this is just a case, just to show how home ownership, I think of, when you think of the things that you do to prepare yourself financially, I think of it like a pyramid. Like, where do you start? What's the bedrock? What do you do? What's the most important thing to do? And I've never heard anybody argue with this, but I'm open to ideas. But the very first one is, like, learn how to spend less than you make. Everything else is difficult if you're not doing that. But after that, I'm a big proponent of stop paying your biggest expense, stop giving it to somebody else, which is your shelter. Give that money to yourself instead of somebody else. And then there's things like, pay off debts, save X amount, and so on and so forth. But home ownership is one of the most basic things that you can do to put yourself in a position to be able to save and make more later on, because it simply costs less and you get something for the money you're paying. Oh, and not only do you have that $2.8 million of equity by year 35, you're also saving $8,000 a month. It's like an infusion of a six-figure income into your household. I know that $8,000 times 12 isn't six figures, but remember, this is after-tax money. You pay rent with after-tax money. You have to earn a bunch of money, give a bunch to Uncle Sam, and then pay your landlord so that he can buy his investment, or she, right? Anyway, I'm kind of spending a lot of time on that because I'm very passionate about that, because there are people telling my kids that that's a bad idea and it's going to ruin them. Anyway, so let's talk about house hacking. Does everybody know what that means? Do you want me to define that? Raise your hand if you would like me to just cover that real quick. Okay, it just means getting income out of the house you're living in. So it could be like just renting some rooms out to roommates. It could be, this stands for accessory dwelling unit. So if you have a property and then there's another detached, or it could be attached, but it's a separate unit where somebody could rent it, they've got a kitchen, a bathroom, whatever, those are called ADUs. And then a plex, so you could do a duplex, a triplex, a fourplex, something like that, rent out the other side, live in one of them. All those are considered house hacking. So it's collecting income from the house that you are living in, your own shelter. So this is the tool that I use to run scenarios and to show what's happening to your wealth in different categories. This one compares renting versus owning. Here are the variables that I'm using. I'm assuming you're renting something for $1,200 a month now. So this isn't a house, that's probably a studio or something like that, or a one bedroom. Am I close on $1,200 for a one bedroom place around here? Okay. So I figured I'm not in that market so much. So $1,200 a month, and then let's say there's $450 a year in renter's insurance for your stuff. If there's a leak and your stuff gets ruined, do you know that that's not insured and the landlord doesn't have to pay that? Yeah, if that property ruins your stuff, that is not the landlord's problem. Your stuff is gone. Renter's insurance, get that if you don't have it. Anyway, so it's costing, if this number is divided by 12, we'll add that to the 1,200, it's costing you $1,238 a month to rent that.
The thing about renter's insurance is I require every one of my tenants to have renter's insurance and list me on the policy. So that if something really bad happens, there is no actually kicking to help you too, as a landlord.
Yeah.
So there's additional stuff to that, but I require every tenant that rents from me to get renter's insurance and then name me on the policy.
Yeah, I think sometimes they think that if the house ruins their stuff, they can go after the landlord and they can't. Anyway, that's a good thing to have. So now I'm assuming that you find a property for $450,000 that you want to buy to house hack. You put 5% down. Again, these are just examples. We do a lot of properties that are way less than 5, but I'm just using that as an example. Let's say there's some closing costs for the loan at $4,800. Again, I'm estimating on the high side. Let's say you get a loan rate of 6 5/8, 6.625 is a 30-year loan. There's some mortgage insurance for $150 a month, and that lasts for 3 years. There's your taxes, your insurance. All these are reasonable numbers. This number is a percentage of the value of the house that we're assigning toward maintenance and repairs. About 0.5%, which is $2,000 a year. Now, by the way, this is just a spreadsheet, and all the colored cells are the variables. I should have mentioned that earlier. And this is showing income collecting $600 a month. I think it was $600 from 4 rooms, or was it $800 from 3?
$600 for 4.
Okay, so if you got a 5-bedroom house, you're living in one, renting out 4 others for $600 a month, very, very doable. Are we out of bounds on any of these numbers? Real estate experts in here. Okay, so that means that you could be collecting $2,400 a month from roommates in that home, and I'm just assuming that we're gonna show a 15-year projection. I'm just assuming that you do that for 15 years. A lot of times people house hack for less years than that because then they start a family and take up some of the rooms, or they don't do house hacking anymore. But I'm just showing this lasting throughout the projection. Now these are the assumptions that I'm using: 3.5% rent increase, 4.5% appreciation on the home, and 3.5% inflation on expenses like repairs and such, and insurance. And that creates some graphs. I'm going to get a little, or zoom into these in a little bit, but those are the variables that I'm using that give us the numbers we're about to look at. So there's the rent, right? We said it was $1,238 a month, which was $1,200 plus the $38 for the insurance. That's just going to keep going up. This is the cost of your net outlay when you're house hacking this particular house. Right? You've got the mortgage, you've got other expenses, but you're also collecting $2,400. Your out of pocket is $981 a month. It's not that different. You're not saving a ton of money there, but this is a number that goes down. Why does that go down? Because you're increasing rent all the time, so it lowers your cost of living. This jump here is when the mortgage insurance goes away. That's why it drops specifically between 2 and 3 years. And then when this goes below 0, the way this graph is built and reads, when this drops below 0, your net income on that property, you're collecting more than your expenses to live in that home. So you're making money. There's a lot of house hacking strategies where you can, I've seen a lot of people pull it off where you're making your positive cash flow right away. That's a high bar, but it can be done. Anyway, and again, this is just the cash flow. And by year, let's pick something, by year 5, you're $1,000 less per month than if you were renting something, if you stayed in that $1,200 a month rent. Here's your net outlay. So this is all the money that you're spending accumulated year after year. So by year 5, you've spent $79,000, almost $80,000 in rent. Again, you've given that away to an investor. That's, by the way, that's a good promotion for investing in real estate. Landlords do okay, right? So as a rental, you've spent $80,000, whereas if you house hack this particular example, you're out of pocket $51,000. We haven't even talked about equity yet. You've just saved, 30 grand on your living expenses over 5 years. After 15 years, you're talking about 225 grand. Now, Ryan, I know some of his examples of properties that he's house hacked. What he does is he builds these, he house hacks them. I'm speaking for you, correct me if I'm wrong about any of this. He house hacks them, and then once he does some work on them, and then once he likes it the way it is, he moves out and even rents out the room that he was in and goes and does it again, and does that serially. So after 15 years, $225,000 was saved before we've talked about any equity. So not only did you save $225,000, you also have $560,000 worth of equity that the renter has nothing, that spent a lot more and has nothing for. I'm not sure I said that correctly, but I think you all know what I mean. Now, 15 years might seem like a long time, but even if we just go out 5 years, right? Here, you've saved $30,000 and you have $160,000 to show for it. That's a pretty big deal. We're talking real numbers real quick. How are we doing on time? Am I boring the hell out of everybody?
10 more minutes.
Okay. So one shift that I like to make when I talk about this stuff, so we talk about projections, 5 years, 10 years, 15, and sometimes that can just seem like a long way out. Like, I've got time, that's a good idea, but I'm going to do it later, I've got time. So what I want to do for the next 5 or 10 minutes is talk about what happens each and every month. So the way I do this, imagine this block represents all of your wealth. Doesn't matter what the number is, it's going to be different for you than it is for you and you. But let's imagine that's all the wealth that you've got. And I'm just going to zoom in on the top part of that because that's the part that's affected when we make payments. So if I'm looking at my first rent payment, so today I decide to rent and I'm paying that $1,200 plus a little bit of insurance, $38, and my wealth has diminished by $1,238. That's pretty straightforward when you're renting because you get nothing back for it, right? You don't get any equity, you don't get any income from roommates. You spent $1,238 and that diminishes your wealth by that exact amount. No appreciation. Your net wealth difference was $1,238 to the negative. That one's easy. Home ownership is a little different. There's a few more moving parts here, a few more components. There's the tax and the insurance. In this example, that's about $325 a month. That diminishes your wealth. There's no getting around that. The interest and the PMI, that's a big one because interest is higher in the earlier years in a mortgage than later because you had the outstanding balance is larger. That's why. Sometimes people will say banks are greedy because they take all their interest up front and they build it to suit themselves. And it's like, no. Like the way the banking works in the United States is like the best it's ever worked in human history and just about the best in the world. Is something worth being grateful for. The fact that you can borrow sometimes, if you're a veteran, 100% of the cost to buy a home, that's pretty amazing. Not that it doesn't need some improvements, but the reason interest is high on loans in the beginning is because the outstanding balance is the biggest. You haven't paid any off yet. So in this example, you've got some interest and mortgage insurance, $2,500. That's a big one. Now I marked where rent ended on the last one about here, so we've already spent more. We've already given up more wealth for home ownership than we did when we were renting so far. And then there's the principal of $377. So our total mortgage payment is $3,212. That includes the principal, the interest, the PMI, and tax and insurance. But we get to add some stuff back. Oh, whoops, I forgot about maintenance. Yes. Now you may not spend $169 a month on maintenance, but I like to subtract that out of your cash flow as if it's going into some account that you don't get to touch, because that's the conservative way to run the financial models, like you're losing it every month, even though that's not the way it would work in real life. It's the conservative way to model that financially. Okay, so now you're out of pocket. Your ownership costs are $3,381 in that month, a lot more than the $1,238 that it was for renting. However, first of all, we get our debt pay down back. That isn't technically a cost. It's called a capital expense in accounting. You're taking cash out of the bank and putting it into another place in your net wealth, which is equity in the home. So we call it a cost often because it's simple to do that and it's lumped in with all those other costs, but it's not technically a cost. You get that money right back, dollar for dollar. And that's smaller. That's smaller in the early years, and it gets bigger and bigger as the loan gets paid down. So it starts at $377, so you get that back, and then you get the income from your roommates. You get that back, and what else do you get? That is absolutely correct, but I don't talk about the taxes because that's different for everybody. But I forgot, I'm glad you mentioned that because there are also significant tax benefits for home ownership. It just affects everybody differently depending on your tax situation. But thank you for bringing that up because that is big, especially now. Well, I'm going to leave that just for the sake of time. But yes, that's a good point. You get some tax benefits. You pay fewer taxes by owning a home. That's another way in which our society, our country, is promoting home ownership. They want people to own their homes. But what else do you get in the form of wealth when you own a home? Because you're not renting it, you own the equity, right? So you got the debt pay down, but if it appreciates by 4.5% per year, that's an average of $1,688 per month. It's not always that smooth, of course, but we're averaging things out here. So you get $1,688 a month of appreciation. Now I actually overshot where my wealth started, so I had to draw a line here to show this is where we started. Within the very first month, we're wealthier than we were before we started. That looks really fun. So we compare our wealth. Now, it's not huge. I gained $1,000 of wealth by doing that. And so that's where people might say, you know, in the traditional finance, they might say, yeah, but if you put all that money in the stock market, you'd have more than that. Like, yeah, but if you did that, you would be renting, and it would cost you this. It's the difference between these two that matters, because you got to live somewhere. So I'm ahead by $2,300 in the very first month, and that's the worst one, because my rent today is the smallest it will ever be, assuming I stay in something similar and stay in this area, right? You might move to a less expensive town or something. But my rent today is the smallest it will ever be because it creeps up. And my cost of a mortgage is the highest today it will ever be. So that improves, and rent gets worse, and it's already a $2,300 advantage to me in the very first month. And that happens month after month after month, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So by year 3, so this is 37 months later, I'm not going to go through each item, but now rent is costing $1,420 between rent and insurance. Here are the numbers for the ownership. So now my wealth difference is a little higher than it was when I started, so that's cool. But also, I'm avoiding paying rent now, which is bigger than it used to be, and my difference is now $3,100 a month just 3 years later. And it's happened 36 times, and that's the 37th time, and it just keeps creeping up. There's the number for 5 years. I'll just show this one. Now after 5 years, we're at $3,600. At 10 years, we're making progress compared to our hypothetical selves that stayed renting by $5,000 a month just because we own the shelter instead of giving the money to somebody else. It's massive. It's so big. There's no kinds of returns you can get anywhere else that are going to offset that. Now this is a graph of all that stuff mashed together. So before I had the graph of the outlay. Now this is a graph of the outlay and what you got in return for it. Now the renting one is going to look familiar. Remember how I said it was $286,000 to rent something over 15 years? That number is the same because there's nothing to offset it. All the money you sent out is gone, and there's nothing to get you any money back. The outlay for owning the home is something, but you also got a bunch of equity in exchange for that. So you're positive 470 versus negative 286. And that difference 15 years out is $750,000. Now that includes the equity and the combination of all the outlays. But even just 5 years down the road, you're talking about a $160,000 difference. Massive. It's real money very, very quickly. Rates. I'll bring this up and then we'll be done. But a lot of people are waiting for rates to do something. I can't stress how incorrect that strategy is, and here's why. First of all, do you guys remember from economics classes in high school or college where the supply and demand curve, right? It's where people with things are willing to sell them at certain prices based on certain quantities, and people who want to buy them are willing to pay for them based on certain quantities and certain prices, and where those things meet, that's the market price in an efficient market. And people want to put that overlay in real estate, and there's one crucial difference in real estate. Two really. One difference is that everybody has to have real estate. If oranges get expensive, you can stop eating oranges and eat apples and bananas instead. But if real estate gets expensive, you don't have a choice, right? You got to pay the landlord or buy it. So that's one difference. But the other difference is that real estate doesn't, that crossover point isn't the price of the real estate, it's the amount of the monthly payment. Because when people buy a home, they don't say, well, that's too expensive, $475. I promised myself I wasn't going to spend more than $470. They never talk like that. they say $3,300 a month, I can only afford $3,000. That's the number that is in everybody's mind because they base it on their monthly budget. And because of that, this monthly payment is what people shop on, and the value and the rates are on two ends of that fulcrum in a seesaw. So if rates were to drop today by 1.5%, 1.5%, what would happen to values? They would go crazy. People would come out of the woodworks and want to start buying again, and the values would go nuts. And because of that, think of this. The monthly payment, that's the piece that's subject to inflation, by the way, and it rarely, if ever, goes backwards. Unfortunately, in recent history, it did go backwards. After the 2008 crash, real estate went on sale because there was so much empty real estate all over the country that was an anomaly. That's not in the near future. There's no inventory, and we shored up a lot of the evil practices that Wall Street and the mortgage industry were. I don't think there was any mastermind evil person making it happen, but it got out of control, and that's been shorn up. This almost never goes backwards. So if you're looking at a $3,300 payment and you're thinking, well, I'm going to wait until that house is going to cost me $3,000 a month instead, it's not going to happen. Because if rates drop, the value is going to go up, and you'll just have to borrow more money to get that house anyways. Now, you might get a lower rate, but if you borrowed more money to do it and you're still paying $3,300 a month, you're in a worse off scenario. I'm posing this question. Would you rather borrow less money at a higher rate or more money at a lower rate if the payment was the same? If you think that through, the answer should always be, I'd rather borrow less money at the higher rate. Because two things are at my advantage. First of all, if I ever decide I want to chip away at that debt faster, I have a lower balance that I have to chip away at. That's helpful. Second of all, if rates ever drop, I can refinance that. If I wait for rates to drop, my payment is still $3,300, but I won't refinance because I already waited for the rates to drop, and I just had to pay more for that house. So this whole system is always moving up with inflation because this is the part that doesn't go down. So the idea is there's only one way you're going to get that $3,000 a month payment and buy that same house that you want. And I can't even guarantee this. But the only way to do that is to buy it today and hope that you can hope the rates are kind and you refinance down into that. But if you wait for rates to go down, the best you're going to get is that you're just borrowing more money but still having that $3,300 payment. What's more likely to happen is now the payment will go to $35,000 and then $38,000, and then when it's $4,000, you're like, well, I guess it's not going down to $3,000. I should probably do something about this. Only you've lost 8 years, and time and money, like time is the most important component in all of this stuff. So I want rates to drop too. That's great. Everybody knows that a 5% rate is better than a 6% rate. It's better than a 7% rate. And the only downside to waiting for rates to drop is you do get to tell your friends at the gym that you got a 5% rate instead of a 6. For whatever reason, I'm human too. I like it too. I like that my house is under a 3% mortgage rate. That's fun to talk about. But it's funny, if people say that at the gym, I say the gym, but wherever in social environments, people are like, oh, I love my house. I got a 3% rate. Say, what's your balance? And they never know that. But that's kind of important, right? Maybe even more important. Also, it's harder to remember because it's always changing. So I'm not looking down my nose at people that are doing that. But if the rates do go down, you're better off owning the home first because you can refinance down to that and it will push the value up, which belongs to you. If you wait for the rates to drop, you're going to have to buy that value from somebody else. And you're still going to have that payment. It will probably be higher. You'll just be lucky if it's the same. So if you don't own a home, real easy to get in. And I'm not even talking about that CHAFA program where we're helping somebody get in for $1,500. If you're a veteran, I know that's common around here, zero, you can get in for nothing. Just a conventional loan, you can get in for 3%, FHA 3.5%. These exist for, this is a lot more lenient on your credit. So if you have no credit or worse credit, FHA loans are government subsidized loans that help people in that position get homes. Like there's all sorts of economic tailwind incentives, thank you, for people to get into homes. That's good for society. Take advantage of those because it's really good for you. That's it. Any thoughts or questions, any ideas? Was that fun? Who wanted to talk economics and numbers on a Thursday evening? Yeah, we do. Well, cool. I thank you for listening. Ryan, do you have anything you want to say? I'm finished with that stuff.
Yeah, give it up for Brady.
Thanks, guys.
You got time to stick around for a couple minutes if people want to talk, or do you got to get back to Denver?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Brady will stick around for a couple minutes if you want to chat. We'll be back here the second Thursday in what's the next month? September. So